what is the endpoint of the love story? Endpoint of the love story is not for either of the individuals to gain the upper hand, to gain more power, to be proven right. No, the ending of the love story is that each helps the other grow. This is the great lesson of love, and I think it applies to work. It applies to how you treat the other employees, how you treat the customer. It's doing things that actually help someone else live. And if you can do that in your company, those customers are going to feel it, and you're going to have what every company wants, which is a lifetime customer.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. From an early age, Jon Truby knew that stories are not just something that happens on a page. Story is all around us. It structures how we interpret events and even how we decide how to live. For Jon, story forms explain the deep ways that the world works. I wanted to have Jon on the show to talk about his latest book, The Anatomy of Genres, and how we might apply his wisdom to better lead and to better design work people love. Jon's the founder and director of Truby's Writer Studio in Los Angeles, where he teaches novelists, screenwriters, and TV writers the deep secrets of what makes a great story. His students have generated more than $15 billion at the box office, and studios like Sony Pictures, Disney, Fox, HBO, and AMC routinely consult Jon on how to improve the stories they tell. In this episode, Jon and I discuss the 14 genres that help us filter life events and especially structure life at work. We talk about sales as an action story, business analysis and scientific research as detective stories, corporate culture as a Western, high-tech as science fiction fantasy, and how horror and the horror genre lurks in the shadows around every layoff, as well as other topics. I think you're going to find that Jon's enthusiasm for the art of storytelling is highly infectious. All right, if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to Work for Humans wherever you listen to podcasts. Your support moves this podcast forward, and I do appreciate it. And now I bring you Jon Truby. Jon Truby, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
I spent the last week deeply immersed in your book genres, and I'm gonna read the whole title because the whole title is super important to us, which is The Anatomy of Genres: How Story Forms Explain the Way the World Works. And I'd like to start with just the question of, when did you first start seeing patterns in story structure and realize that there was something to illuminate there and to explore?
Well, Dart, that's a great question. And it takes me back a long time because I was fairly young there. It really started in my sophomore literature class in high school. I had a first-time teacher, never taught before, and he decided he would break the rules of the curriculum that the school had put down and teach a bunch of 16-year-olds Northrop Frye's Theory of the Hero. Now, this is the first section from Northrop Frye's book, The Anatomy of Criticism, which is probably the best book on story in history. And I include Aristotle's Poetics with that. And it's philosophically quite advanced. But that was the first time I ever consciously thought, no, this is how the world really works. And from that, my own thinking on story has developed over more than 50 years. But that's where I came to believe that story is the greatest form of knowledge there is. And it gave me an aesthetic filter for seeing what's really happening under the surface. And to this day, I think there is no better way to understand how the world works.
Well, what we're going to do is we're going to bring this around to the experience of work, which is such a big part of our lives. And when we get there, we're going to talk about how story fits into the experience of work. But I want to dig into how story connects to the world first. So do you see world events through a genre lens and through a story lens?
Oh, absolutely. The 14 genres that I talk about in the book are really 14 different filters into how the world operates. And when I say that, I mean two things by that. And it really comes from the subtitle of the book, which is How Story Forms Explain the Way the World Works. That means two things. It means, first of all, how the world works, but secondly, and more importantly, how to live successfully in it. That means that genres, which are types of stories, are really giving us different packaged life philosophies for how to live well. And if I may just give you a couple of one-line examples from the beginning of the book. And when you hear these, you really realize, oh, that's what I thought that story form was about, but it's really something else. So, for example, memoir is not about the past, it's about creating your future. Fantasy is about finding the magic in the world and in ourselves to turn life into art. Detective fiction shows us how to think successfully by comparing different stories to learn what is true. And finally, love stories reveal that happiness comes from mastering the moral act of loving another person. The moral act of loving another person. And right there, you get an example of, we think love stories, oh, it's about that fabulous emotion of love. Well, yeah, that's the baseline of it. That's how it's structured. But what really it's about on a deeper level is the moral act of love. That's a hard thing to learn.
That's fascinating. I want to read what the genres are so that people have this framework when they're listening to this. So there's horror, there's action. And by the way, even horror, at the very beginning of this, when we look at horror, your first thought is slasher, gore, but no, it's about religion.
Yeah.
It's about how we face life and death. And so it's horror, action, myth, the life process, memoir, and coming of age story, which go together, which makes sense based upon what you said, that memoir is about the future, science fiction, crime, comedy, western, gangster, fantasy, detective story and thriller, and love story. And for you, these are progressive. They are progressively, they become more complex, more advanced. And ultimately, the love story is one of the most advanced and sophisticated forms.
I'm so glad that you picked up on that, Dart, because probably the most revelatory thing for me in writing the book was that they're progressive, that they're not just, these are the different genres that we see in stories all over the world. No, depending upon how you look at their philosophy of life, the theme that they're expressing, you get a progressively higher level of action. And that doesn't mean that the, quote, lower genres are worse. It's just they're more basic. So, for example, horror is really about how do you face death. And the main way that human beings in history have dealt with that is through religion. Right above horror is action, because that's about the baseline of, in terms within the human realm, it's you either take action or you die. Then you move all the way up to the, what I consider to be the highest forms are fantasy, detective, and love. And to me, the idea is to learn the philosophy of each one and not necessarily choose one above the others, but learn and benefit from all of them, because it is the kaleidoscope of all of them that gives us the richest life we can possibly have.
And so there's kind of two aspects to this, which is there's our experience of the story we're in, which is that first person experience of a story we are living. And then there's this other part, which is the stories people tell to reframe the life that we're living. I wonder if you see this, for instance, I know that one of the things you mentioned is that your father was a West Point graduate. And so when you look at something like the war in Ukraine and you watch Zelensky, who's an artist, frame that story, do you see that as storytelling, and how's it working?
I love that example because I do see Zelensky as a storyteller, a master storyteller. He's one of the best I've ever seen in terms of telling his story and the story of his nation in this, what I talk about in the book, is an action epic. He is living and telling an action epic, which is almost always some form of war story that determines the fate of a nation. But if you look at everything about this guy, his clothes, his manner, his direct talk, his confidence, he is what I see as a modern day warrior Winston Churchill. And I think the whole world, other than the Russians themselves, are pulling for this guy to succeed. And I think he will. It's one of the most amazing stories I've ever lived through.
And when we watch a story on the screen or in the world, what's our relationship to it? What I'm getting at is, do we become a character in the story as we watch it? Do we find somebody to anchor to? And do we get to choose which character it is? What is that relationship?
Well, you put your finger on the first and most important strategy of the storyteller, which is to create a main character who the audience can identify with and essentially become one with. And then what we do is we create an emotional hook for that character to hook the audience. And I always I use the metaphor of we get on the train together and then we go down the tracks. And at the end of those tracks is the hero's goal. So we want to get everybody invested in wanting to get what the hero wants to get. And then we watch as the hero goes up against various opponents. We're trying to stop him from getting that. And so what we get strategically for the storyteller is we get two tracks that we're really following in a story. The surface track is the desire line. It's what the hero wants. And we want to set that up at the beginning so that the audience wants it as well. But there's also a subterranean track, which the audience is not aware of, but is really much more important. That has to do with the interior flaw of the character. That's the real problem that we're solving for. In the act of going after the goal and running up against various opponents, he is going to be forced to deal with that internal flaw and either fix it or die. And so at the end, that's where the subterranean track connects up with the surface track, because we get a final step for the character, which I talk about in the book as the self-revelation. This is the moment when the character learns, aha, that's what I've been doing wrong all this time. That's the real thing I've got to deal with. And usually in the best stories, it is a moral flaw. It is something I've been hurting other people in certain ways. I wasn't aware of it, or I was aware of it, but I was willing to do it anyway. And I realize now that that's wrong and I've got to change. So that's the moment of change that we're really going for. And that is the moment when the audience feels tremendous emotional relief, catharsis from having experienced this story along with the hero.
We're churning out a lot of stories right now. I mean, more than I've ever seen. And a large percentage of them are just the surface, and they never get to that lower thing.
That's right.
And one of the things you point out in the book is that to be really a great story today, because we're all such experts in viewing them, and we've all gotten so advanced in what we expect from story, that the genres mix.
Yeah. This is one of the 2 or 3 most important strategies for writers today, because, as you just pointed out, the audience is so familiar with stories. They see so many of them that if you just give them a single genre, I've seen it. It's very hard to do something new in a single genre that the audience is not going to be bored with. And so, because one of the biggest trends, most important developments in the last 20 years in worldwide story, worldwide in every medium, is this density of plot. In other words, we're trying to give the audience more plot for the same period of time. And that's, again, because they are familiar with the plot beats that they've seen so many times before. So what is the best way to do it? You mix 2 or 3 genres, because each genre has 15 to 20 plot beats that are always there. And that's one of the ways we define the form, is a sequence of specific plot beats that you know are going to happen. You don't know exactly how they're going to happen, but you know they're going to be there. Now, so when you mix genres, what you do is you double or triple the number of plot beats in the same unit of time. And all of a sudden, the audience goes, wow, this thing is really rolling along and I love it and I don't know what's going to happen. And interestingly enough, what changed the entire storytelling world and moved us into this area of mixed genres was the original Star Wars, because that was the first time that you put together, that a writer, in that case also the director, put together a number of genres into the same story. And from then on, it was a multi-genre world in every medium.
We're going to get this conversation closer and closer to the experience of work. But the truth is, life is a multi-genre experience. One of the biggest questions is always like, what genre am I in right now? And what character am I playing in this genre? I know, for instance, I left a job and a career because I was going to be the sidekick. And that's not the character I wanted to play. And so I want to talk about the relationship of work to different genres. I know we're going to talk about detective. I know we're going to talk about memoir. I think we're going to talk about horror. Let's start with detective.
As you know, detective stories are about solving a puzzle. That puzzle usually has to do with who killed who. But detective is much deeper than that. It's really about how the mind works and how the mind works well and how we can become smarter, how we can use our mind to its fullest capacity. Now, when you apply that to work, there's really two aspects you want to look at. Part of it has to do with the type of job that you do. So examples of detective jobs would be reporter, scientist, cop, academic. But the other part, and this is true of the other genres as well, this is even more true about the other genres, where there isn't a particular job that is connected to it, but it's the approach that you take to the work. So in the case of detective, it's a story that is applied to challenging the mind. And so the question for you in work is, do you actively try to dig deeper into the intellectual element of your work to become even better at what you do? And I would argue that if your work is not constantly making you think and solve problems, it will eventually destroy your soul. It is that crucial to take that approach, that detective approach to the work that you're doing. Because the mind, of course, what sets us apart from the animals. So if your work is not challenging your mind in a way that is uniquely you, the things that you care about mentally, I think the toll is devastating. And I think we so often, all of us can fall into this trap of letting the job become rote repetition. The reason they call work is because it's hard. There's certain things that have to be done. They're not creative. They're not challenging of the mind at all. And so it's very easy when you do it day after day after day to fall into that trap of just, well, this is how I do it. And so this is how I'm going to do it today. But I think when you do that, you're essentially reducing yourself to a robot.
That's interesting. I talked to a lot of management philosophy experts. And one of the things that they argue for is that work should not be broken up into rote steps. And for purposes of achieving scale, that people should be more involved in the full life cycle of production and involved in problem solving within the full life cycle of production, as opposed to being, compartmentalized. And I will tell you, as we go through this, they also argue the more advanced you get amongst these thinkers, that love is an important part of work. And so we'll get to that. But you're right. And I had the odd experience. I was actually an investigator. I was a criminal defense investigator for 5 years. So my work was detective work. And then I became an analyst, and my job was detective work. Underlying it is what can I know for sure? That's like one of the biggest mysteries that goes with that kind of work is, can I be sure? What are the limits of knowledge? How do I acquire certainty? There's a real narrative tension there. And I can tell you from having done this that I used to read in the newspaper opinion articles about my clients when I was an investigator, and everybody would say they were guilty or innocent or something like that. Everybody had an opinion. I didn't know.
Right.
And I was the investigator. And so there's deep, deep mystery that goes there, and it's super rich and it's endless.
In every chapter, I talk about how do you not only tell the story, how do you transcend the story? In other words, how do you tell the story in a way that's so unique that nobody writing a detective story has ever done it like that before? Because that's how you reach greatness as a storyteller in a particular genre. But that is also applied to your work. And it gets to the central question you just pointed out, which is the highest level of detective story is about how the mind works and the nature of truth. How do we know what we know? How are we sure about that? And one of the problems that we get into, especially in our time, where technology is so advanced, here's the problem that it gives us relative to truth. Modern technology magnifies exponentially our ability to divide image from object and dividing our image of ourselves from ourselves. And that makes determining the truth much more difficult. And I believe that it is essential for us in our work and in our life that we constantly fight to know what is true and look for a method to help us get to the truth. We never get to quote the truth ever, but there is a certain method that we can work through that can get us a lot closer than if we just go along with what we hear constantly from whatever source of authority we hear it from. And what I point out in the book is the great danger in terms of the detective form, the great danger for the mind is that it becomes ideological. In other words, the way that we think hardens into a fixed cement, and then we are unable to see the truth because we can't even see facts when that happens. And then our ability to know the truth goes out the window. And so this is why the method that we take to get to the truth is so important, because that's our only chance to try to break through the ideological cement that is normal for everyone to have.
That's a very, very interesting point. I've always found it one of the most beautiful things to examine in work is that boundary between what can be known and what isn't. But also, the most delightful moments in work are those moments when something that you thought was a fixed assumption that couldn't be changed is undermined and you find yourself at a lower level. Like you break through something that was an assumption and you find out it's just not true anymore.
Yeah. And that I think should be embraced. It's so unpleasant for us to find out that everything we've based our life on, that we do every day, hey, that pillar may not be real. That may not be the truth. It's tough to face unless you take an ongoing approach that I want to know. And this is extremely important in the creative world. In the creative world, you have people will write their story. And one of the biggest marks of an amateur is they don't want to hear criticism. One of the marks of a professional is give me more. I want as much critique as you can give me because that's the only way I can get better. I don't take it personally. In fact, I'm honored that you would take the time to want to give me this feedback. But this is true, I think, in any work that we do. You want to seek out people who can tell you, look, you might want to try it this way, or this doesn't really work right now, or it's not working for you. It may have worked for you in the past, but it's not working for you now. And those are the people that you want on your team because they can only make you better.
Yeah, it's one of the things I've seen in the scientific world, which is before you publish a paper, you take it before the whole department. And it's a very wholesome experience. Let's go on to memoir. And interestingly, I had on the show very recently a memoirist, and I talked to him about how people look back at their careers and what they want from it. So this is a very good continuation of that conversation.
Memoir is really important. I consider it something that every person should do in their life. And I talk in the book that it isn't on the bucket list. It is the bucket list. This is where you look at your entire life as a whole and you say, how was I unique? How was I valuable? How was I important? And the thing that I mentioned right up front, the common conception about memoir is that it's where you talk about the past. Well, yes, you do talk about the past, but to what purpose? The purpose is to see the patterns in my life, many of which have held me back and have hurt me, so that I can make decisions and changes now that can give me a better future. So memoir is an example of one of those genres where there is no real job that you have, at least in the everyday world, where you are paid to write memoirs. It's really the approach that you take to your job. And even in a creative profession like writing, you probably aren't doing the job in order to have a good legacy. No, you're doing it to create. But the power of looking at your work through the memoir filter is that you always have the long view. You're always saying, what am I leaving behind here? So I believe that instead of getting to the end of your life and saying, I wish I'd done my work differently, which is what you would possibly do when you were writing a memoir. No, you want to make decisions right now that guarantee that 30 years from now, you'll be proud of what you did. And this is very difficult for people to do in the present tense of their life, especially when they're right in the midst of a very intense job. Maybe you've got a lot of deadlines. You're very tactically involved. Memoir is strategy. Memoir is backing out, saying, hold on, let's stop for a second. Let's look at the big picture. Am I doing the right job? It's that classic distinct business distinction between efficient and effective. It's not about being efficient. It's about being effective. It's not about doing the job right. It's about doing the right job. And that's what the memoir mentality gives you. It gives you an idea of what is the value of the work that I'm doing right now and the way that I'm doing it. And I want to do it to the best that I can so that 30 years from now, I can say, I did great work.
I'm going to go back and do this about Detective 2. What's a film that you consider is one of the highest examples of the memoir coming of age story?
In my opinion, the greatest coming of age film ever made is the Italian film Cinema Paradiso. Now, some of your listeners may not be that familiar with the film. I think it came out in the late 80s. It starts off, as many memoirs do, with the person, he's a well-known movie director. He gets news that his old childhood mentor has died. And this causes him to think back on his life, and his life, especially as a boy, when he knew this guy who was a projectionist in the local theater called Cinema Paradiso. And the brilliance of this film is that it connects the boy's growth with the growth of this particular movie house, with the growth and essentially decline of the town. And what you see is when he looks at the big picture, he sees how the loss of that community that he had with his mentor, with his friend, and the loss of community that the town had when they went to the movies every Saturday night. This was the greatest time of his life. And now when now he's rich and he's famous and he's so on, and he's not happy. And it's because those things that really matter, he left behind. And the thought of, I've got to be ambitious. I'm not saying you don't want to be ambitious in your life, but the question is, ambitious in what way and at what cost? And this is what the memoir filter, the memoir mentality always gets us to do. It is the most strategic of all genres.
Fascinating. I want to go back and just catch up on one thing that I didn't ask before, which is on detective. What is the detective story that you would point to as the purest or best form of that genre?
Well, that's a tough question. You can go back to, interestingly enough, the person who invented the detective form is Edgar Allan Poe, one of the great writers of all time who created an entire genre, and probably the modern genre, which is detective. And he also created the modern psychological horror story. To do one of those is amazing. To do both of them is extraordinary. But of course, the classic detective story is Sherlock Holmes. And even though he is basically playing out many of the beats that Edgar Allan Poe laid out in the first detective story. But Sherlock Holmes is a perfect example of, it's really about how the mind works. Because what Sherlock Holmes is great at is observing. He looks at the facts. He looks at the evidence. He looks at the detail. And from there, he induces a larger theory of what actually happened. And what most people don't realize is the detective story is really a competition of stories. One is provided by the detective. The other is provided by the killer. Each is putting out a different theory of who actually committed the crime. And each is based on the physical evidence that is there. So therefore, it turns on how that physical evidence is interpreted. But it all starts with the detail, and it all starts with observing that. And the beauty of Sherlock Holmes' mind is he's not ideological. He doesn't start with the ideology, the theory, and go to the specific evidence. He starts with the evidence and goes to the theory. And that's the great lesson of detective.
Now I want to talk about the Western. And, the Western is misunderstood, I think. So There's a couple of different things. We haven't talked about action, but in the action genre, one of the things you pointed out is that good living is doing. That's what it's about. Well, the Western is kind of this case, it seems to me. Well, and doesn't just seem to me, it's something you said. It's about civilization, and it's about how civilization is won from chaos. And right at that edge, there's often a person of action who may not fit in the civilization at the end of the day. And that's one of the big mysteries. One of the big questions is whether or not this character is going to, who is necessary to create civilization, is going to actually fit inside. Inside every company, there's that fight. A company is a frontier. It's building its own culture. It's building its own civilization inside. And there's the fight between chaos, which is innovative and edgy and all about doing. And then there's this other side, which is about control and about standards and about, so there's, to me, I see a Western inside every company. And the salespeople, by the way, they're action figures.
Yeah.
It's all about doing. And then the operations people are about, can we just put this in order a little bit? So let's talk about Western. What do I have that? Have I characterized that correctly?
You have. And by the way, there is a strong connection between Western and action. I talk in the book that there are not just individual genres, there are families of genres. And one of the families of genres is myth, Western, and action. And they all have at their heart an action hero. Now, the difference with the Western is America's creation myth. And it tracks this, and it always set on the border, on the frontier. It always tracks this move from wilderness to civilization. And what that means is that the Western is about the rise of the American dream. It's about building American civilization. And it's about that can-do spirit. We can, through hard work and individual hard work, create something of value. And when we put all of those individual hard works together, we get a civilization that's worth fighting for. Now, the problem with the Western is that the historical factors of it, the forces of land, people, technology that made it possible, ended at the end of the 19th century. So the Western, in its most popular time, in the early and middle 20th century, was really about a dream that no longer existed in the sense of actually taking place. The 20th century was about the corporation. The 20th century was about the civilization's been built, and now we're going to build massive interconnections among all of these people within a larger framework. But the Western is still incredibly valuable because when we think of it as an ethic, not as an actual history of the United States, because historically it's not accurate at all. But I see when we're thinking about a company as a Western, we're talking about most especially when it's first created. And it's in the process of first starting to build its empire. Then you have all of the optimism that you have when you're building the American dream. When you start to get into problems in terms of that optimism with everybody within the company is when they start to lose the sense of we're in this new project together and everything starts to become status quo and it starts to become operational. And we lose that sense of, hey, innovation. We could do it this way. We could try this. We could go off and do that. That's really exciting. And that gets people who are part of that larger organization to feel that they're invested. And I believe it's important in a company that you never lose sight of that individual optimism and creed of, I am important as an individual for making this larger civilization, which we call our company, making that happen. And it's tough to do once the company gets established. It's tough to keep that going and you have to regenerate it. And I think it's important for the leaders of the company to consciously try to keep regenerating that idea, to keep it on the rise as opposed to the sense that, hey, we've kind of made it, so we're just kind of doing it by rote from now on.
I think it's an incredibly powerful point. It's a good example of how the stories that we tell to ourselves inside companies can have an effect on the story we're in. And it's also a very good example of an overlapping genre, which is that there's me and my coming of age story inside a company. And then the context of that might be that I'm in a Western where we are blazing trails into, because it actually crosses over into another genre, which is, I think, science fiction, especially in high tech, which is that we're about how technology is going to create a future for all of us.
Right.
So that's like now we've got three genres together, working together. We've got the personal coming of age and memoir. We've got the Western inside the company. We've got science fiction outside. What is like the quintessential Western?
Quintessential Western is Shane. It boils down all these fundamental pillars of the Western into these key characters. And the sequence of beats is the classic Western. And because you have this Western hero, he's a cowboy, he is not a farmer, and he will never be part of that community. He can help them, he can help build it, he can protect them so they can build it, but he is not going to join. He is Moses. He will point them to the promised land, but he will not be there. So you have two heroes here, and this is, Western is unique in this. You have the main hero who will help with civilization, but he will not actually enjoy it. But then you have the second hero who is the farmer, and he, with his family and the other farmers, they're trying to build their own plot of land, their own little kingdom. They are the entrepreneurs. They are the people who collectively are going to make up this American can-do spirit of the American dream. And they're up against these men from the opponents from an earlier stage of development, the cattlemen. Their cattlemen are about open range. We don't want fences. The farmers are about fences. You got to have fences because this is my land. And so Shane is the key one. Another one that's interesting, that's relevant, I think, to our discussion, though, is Red River. Now, Red River is a story about a guy and his surrogate son, who the lead character is played by John Wayne. And they have this immensely successful ranch in Texas, all these cattle, and they got to get the cattle to market. So they got to go on the classic cattle drive. Well, as the cattle drive goes on and they run into all these obstacles, the hero, John Wayne, becomes a dictator. Then there is his surrogate son, played by Montgomery Clift, stages a coup. And they capture the hero, and they tie him up, and they say, no, we're not doing it that way anymore. And what is the trigger for that? It's because John Wayne wants to, because somebody left the cattle drive, they don't want to be part of this anymore because it's too crazy. They left, they got caught, and now he's going to hang him. You don't get to leave. You're going to get hanged. And so Montgomery Clift says, no, you're not going to do that. And you're not going to be leader anymore. So it's the difference between dictatorship and leadership. Crucial difference, and it's one of the best movies ever to show that. Interestingly enough, modern version of that, which is an action fantasy story, is on television and novel Game of Thrones, which is all about leadership of an organization, or in that case, a kingdom. But those are two, Shane and Red River, I'd say, are the most applicable in terms of thinking of how the Western might infuse your sense within a company.
Yeah, I'm on the operations side. And so a lot of what I've done in my career is try to get things to be just a little bit less of a mess. But I've always been really clear that you can't put up barbed wire everywhere. If you do that and nobody can move, you kill the company. And actually, what's funny is that if the company starts to have too much barbed wire, I take the other role to try to balance it the other direction.
Yeah.
But it's hard to get that balance right. And the bigger the company gets, the less connected you are to its story. You get more and more localized in your story. I want to talk about layoffs. Here's my hypothesis. I think layoffs are beautifully structured horror stories. And the way they work is the village elders somewhere in the past have committed a sin, and it's released a monster that is now stalking the halls or stalking the streets of your village. It's kind of invisible, but then your friends start disappearing. And there's this idea, it's about survival at that point. It's not literal survival, it's certainly metaphorical survival.
Yeah.
And it's incredibly scary. And this is like one of those examples, like some of these narratives that you talk about, like the detective narrative, it's great to live inside them. You want to.
Sure.
The horror narrative's not a great one to live inside. And I almost feel like that it's a narrative that needs to be actively disrupted so that we don't tell the perfect horror story during a layoff. But what is at the core of a horror story? And I guess in this case, how do we make it less good? How do we transform it into a different genre?
You really caught between a rock and a hard place there. And I think you may be, as much as human beings, we want to try to soften that as best we can. The inherent, once you're in that horror story, it's a horror story, and a horror story is a horror story. You can whitewash it, you can change the genres all you want, or try to think of your company back in some of these other genres all you want. But bottom line, if that's the world you're in, it's not going to matter. Because as you say, you're dealing with survival at the basic level, and you have laid out right there a slasher film. That is exactly the structure of a slasher film. So for the employee found in that situation, you may not be dead yet, but you are the walking dead. Let's be very clear about that. You are the walking dead. So now the company, and there are great companies, and they can try to make it a little less Darwinian by cushioning the death with better severance or various things that can soften the blow to some degree. But they're limited as well, because it goes against why they're cutting these employees in the first place, which is ultimately it's about the money. It's not there. And so the first realization that, and this is where I think we see the company in its worst light, which is that the first realization that the employee has in that situation is that they are dead man walking, and that therefore they have to rethink their entire approach to being an employee in that company at all. Because bottom line, as employee, even when you're working for a great company, you are always at the mercy of the owner, who can kill you at any time. And no matter what other things we can do to try to soften that, that's the bottom line. That's the unpleasant truth that we don't want to face. But the quicker you do face it, ultimately, the better off you will be.
Yeah, and one of the things that happens in that situation is that people who might have been in a detective story now have to participate full-time in a horror story. In other words, it's very hard to be both the detective and the Walking Dead.
Yeah, very hard.
Right? It's hard to be in a romance in any way and also be stalked by that. It's a very weird, invisible monster, too. I think that we could learn something about this genre from looking at how it works, which is the closer it gets to you, the quieter things get.
Yep.
Because nobody's going to tell you that it's right next, right? It's like, it's very creepy.
Yeah. But you make a great point, which is that once you're into that horror world, none of those other genres are going to matter. And that's why genre is the first genre. It is about life and death. And so when you're in that game, none of these higher things are possible. You're just trying to live. I'm at the absolute subsistence here. I can't be doing things like, hey, let's do some innovations here and so on and so forth. I'm just trying to get out alive.
So you know a little bit about this, but I've been asking people for a long time what job they hire their job to do for them, because I'm trying to understand what people want from work. And one that I recently came across is I hire my job to forget. And what it was is, this was actually, I watched my father do this, which is that my mother died and he dove into work.
Yeah.
In the very long run, we're all in a horror story. It's a fundamental thing.
We're not going to escape that one.
No, but there is still at least this one case where you can dive into these other genres as a way of forgetting. And actually, I'll add to that legacy, which is that there's this part about memoir, which is that if I can escape this horror story, if I can leave something that goes on, that lives beyond.
Yeah. I think no matter what the circumstance, if you can say to yourself, and this is again where memoir is so valuable, if you can say to yourself, I did something valuable here. I made a difference in some way. Whether I'm going to last longer than what I did, maybe not. But if I can say that I did my best. I did good work. I left something of value. That's all any of us can ever do, I think, in our lives in general. So I think it's always important to maintain that, even in the worst situation, to maintain the sense that I did what I could do. And if you can say that, you're going to be right with yourself. As they say in a classic Western, I want to go into my house justified. When I die, I want to be able to say, I did it right.
Right. I want to talk about romance because now we're talking about doing it right. And we start to get into this piece. I have had somebody on the show. His name is Fred Reichheld. He created the idea of customer loyalty and the importance of loving your customer. And so it's way at the top of sort of Maslow's hierarchy of business. I just made up that term. So we've talked a little bit about the heart of of a romance. What's the best example of that? And how does it exemplify the form?
First of all, you're doing what is important to do in romance, which is to understand that the form is not just a romance between two people in the traditional sense. You can have a love story between a person and anything or anyone else. It's what you love and the obstacles that you run into in terms of bringing that love to fruition. But what is the end point of the love story? End point of the love story is not for either of the individuals to gain the upper hand, to gain more power, to be proven right, so on and so forth. These are all things that they struggle for through the middle of the love story. No, the ending of the love story is that each helps the other grow. Those stories are about blossoming. You used to always start off with two people who are shut down, usually about love. They cannot love for some reason. And in getting together with that other person and learning the best from that other person, each becomes better. And part of that is that they realize that we're better together than we could ever be individually alone. And the reason I have it as the highest of all genres is because it has to do with your relationship to others, relationship to things. Love stories are really about learning the moral act of love. And what that means is, how can I do things that can help that other person have the best life they can have? And when I do that, ironically, paradoxically, I have a better life too. This goes all the way back to Aristotle's view of happiness, which is, it's not just pleasure. It's not just getting the things that you want. It's about having a higher purpose, showing love to others beside yourself, and a feedback loop comes back to you, gives you a far better life and a happier life than you could possibly have just by single-mindedly going after what you want. This is the great lesson of love, and I think it applies to work. It applies to how you do your job, how you treat the other employees, how you treat the boss, how you treat the customer. And if you come at it from love, and we're not talking here about touchy-feely type of stuff, we're talking about caring. I talk in the book about the difference between the feeling of love and the act of love. The act of love is caring. It's doing things that actually help someone else live. And if you can do that in your work, and if you can do that in your company, believe me, those customers are going to feel it, and you're going to have what every company wants, which is a lifetime customer.
I want to talk about what I think is the best love story ever written. Absolutely the best. I'm hoping you've read it. Patrick O'Brian's Boat Books. He wrote 20 books, which are historical fiction. It's 20 books. It's the whole life of the captain of a ship in the British Navy and the whole life of a doctor in the surgeon on the boat. And what's interesting about it as a love story is it takes their whole lives. In other words, it's not just that winning the bride, winning the spouse, winning the romantic, thing. It's not that just the beginning of the love story. It's the whole thing. And it is so hard and so beautiful. What a beautiful writer.
I have not read it. I'd love to, it sounds like.
Unbelievable story.
Historical fiction is set in what time?
Napoleonic Wars.
Right.
And so the New York Times actually said, this is the quote from their review, the best historical fiction ever written.
And the name of the author again is?
Patrick O'Brien.
Right.
There's 20 books. Master and Commander. Master and Commander was the movie, but it was parted out from different books in the whole series.
Growing up, I did read some of the Hornblower stories, which I loved. And it struck me just from distant memory that there were certain similarities there with the Master and Commander.
He picked up from there, as a matter of fact. Patrick O'Brien picked up from the Hornblower series. I mean, in other words, I think deliberately said, the Hornblower series is done, and now I need to move forward with this. Well, I guess I should ask, is there a genre we've left out you think is relevant? These are the ones that, when I read them, I saw the relevance.
I think in terms of the direct application to work, certainly the action form, you've got to talk about that because, and especially you talk about the sales part of the company, that's so relevant in terms of focusing on what's really at stake there. How is it really working? And I think I could easily have talked about business in the action chapter because the action mentality is all about winning. That's it. It's you either win or you lose. And if you lose, you die. And you have any company, any individual worker within the company. If you want to be successful, you got to have a game plan. That game plan should take advantage of the opponent's weaknesses. It should highlight your own strengths. And then you have to execute. And especially in the area of sales, one of the reasons I love the whole aspect of sales is that salespeople can't rationalize. They either made the sale or they didn't. They won or they lost. And I always like to say there is no mercy in sales. It's a similar thing you say in sports. There is no mercy in sports. I'm going to beat you or you're going to beat me, but we're not going to show mercy. And so the great example of this in terms of a film and originally a play is David Mamet's Glengarry Glen Ross, which I'm sure you know and have heard all of the famous lines. But you recall right at the beginning, sets up the whole story with this guy comes down from corporate and he says, we're having a contest. First prize is a new Cadillac Eldorado. Second prize is a set of steak knives. Third prize, you're fired. And these are all sales guys for real estate. And it's very tough. It's very harsh. But I think one of the things I love about it, and I love about this view of sales, is that anytime you see sales in any business, they tend to have this mentality. It's a very sports-focused mentality. And it's a very win or lose. And what comes from that, if you're successful at it, I'm the smartest guy in the room. They always have that mentality.
Now, what's the transformation or the big question for an action hero at the end of the movie?
The big question for the action hero, if it's at a higher level, and again, we're talking about, say, in the difference of horror between a slasher film, which is the lowest level of horror, and a transcendent horror film. In a really good action story, the question is, can he transcend himself? Meaning, can I get away from just, it's me? I work best when I work alone. I'm all about winning, and I'm all against weakness. I will not stand for weakness. And the question is, what does that do? The result of that, the logical result of that is, I'm alone. I will be alone my whole life. And so you get the situation that you get with Shane. Similar thing, which is action within the Western. So the big question for the action hero is, can I overcome my drive to be successful at all costs and form a community or become part of the community and accept, quote, a softer side in myself and in others, instead of looking at it as weakness, looking at as some of the richer forms of living human life. And action form is closest to the animal. And so if you take that to the extreme, your ability to experience the best human elements of life is gone.
This is a good transition into, we've seemed, you argue, have gone through 3,000 years of the male myth.
Yeah.
And it's only recently that we've seen a resurgence of something different. Can you describe that?
Yeah, we are privileged to live through two major revolutions in story. And I'm talking about two major revolutions over the course of mankind. The first of these, which started about 25 years ago, was the rise of television as an art form. And so about 25 years ago, it was the distant stepchild of movies. That's where all the stature was. That's where all the great work was in terms of visual arts. No, not anymore. TV has become the greatest storytelling medium in the world, and the best storytelling coming out of the United States for the last 20 plus years has come from television. And it's not even close. There's a second revolution that's been going on. It's only about 10 years old, and that is the return of the female myth. Now, as you just said, female myth has been gone for 3,000 years. It was wiped out by male warrior societies. And so we lost all female myth storytelling. And it's a major loss in terms of the culture, in terms of how to live a successful life. And just in the last 10 years, it really started with the first Avatar. We have seen female myth stories coming back in the popular medium of film and television, and they're coming back big. I believe they will be huge for decades to come, because what they give us is an approach to solving problems that isn't based on male warrior approaches. And certainly in the modern world that we're in now, we can't afford too much more of this male warrior approach. And the approaches, the problem-solving techniques that the female myth gives us are very much a different way of dealing with conflict, because they're about what can we do to make conflict unnecessary, instead of it being the first thing, the default way we go to get this thing solved, to get what we want. How can we take another approach that minimizes conflict and allows everybody to win? And very difficult to do in storytelling, because storytelling, Western storytelling based on 3,000 years, is based on maximum conflict. And what is maximum conflict? Ultimately, it's war, it's violence. But female myth gives a very different solution in things like Avatar, which is not just about a native society versus a techno society. It's also about female myth versus male myth. But you get stories like Gravity and Inside Out and Arrival. These are all female myth stories that are extremely well done and extremely popular worldwide.
You say the word worldwide. Are there differences in how stories are received worldwide? I've heard stories of plot beats in movies that just are not received the same way. So, male character, hero cries, and the audience just starts laughing. For instance, are there major differences in how stories are received internationally, especially beats?
There are, but it's not really based on the individual beats. It's based on the genre. In other words, there are certain story forms that go worldwide much better than other story forms. The reason that Hollywood makes almost solely superhero movies is it's a combination of myth and action. Myth is the most popular story form worldwide, also the oldest, but to this day, the most popular by far. Why? Because it deals with these elements of both archetypes and in terms of life moments that are universal. Whereas a form that travels worst would be something like comedy, because comedy is often heavily based on the individual culture, even the references of that form. So, for example, I often teach my classes in Europe, and when I would go to London and teach my class, I would always want to go to one or more plays. I was on the West End. I went to this comedy. It was hugely successful in London, and people are laughing the entire time that I'm sitting in the audience. I'm laughing at maybe a third of this stuff. Why? Because I didn't get the references. So even though they had set it up in terms of the overall beats, the normal way you would set up a comedy, what they were referring to, I didn't get. And because comedy is split second, if you don't get it right away, you ain't getting it. And that's why a guy like James Cameron always uses the same three genres, because that combination of genres is the most popular combination in the world: myth, action, and love.
Really interesting. Yeah, I can see comedy. Comedy is so much about status and about what elevates status and what drops people in status, and what that is in different cultures is different. I've been watching a lot of Korean films recently, and young women who stuff their mouths full of food. That's funny. That is a different kind of transgression in Korea than it would be here. And so I recognize it as a joke, but I don't necessarily feel it as a joke. So yeah, this is the question I ask at the end of every show, which is, what do you hire your work to do for you? And I say work in your case because I don't think you have an official job like I do, but you have a lot of work.
Well, my official job is writer. And I love this question because it's a question I think everybody should ask themselves a lot. But if I were to simplify it down, I would say that my job has always been a Western in which I do the work of a detective. I was somebody when I was young who wanted to avoid at all costs being an employee. I wanted to create my own brand. I wanted to build my own empire. And while it's true I haven't built an empire, I have been able to make a good living without interference from other people preventing me from doing the work that I love to do. And that work is being a detective of how the larger world works. And my primary tool for doing that has been story, because story explains how the world works better than any other tool we have. So it's a job that I've had to carve out. It did not exist before I created it, but through basically doing it for a hell of a long time, I've been able to make it work.
And what does it cost you?
Well, the cost has been many years of struggle and poverty, because selling your own individuality usually takes a very long time. I think that's why many employees are employees, because either they want to or need to avoid that struggle and poverty from the very beginning. But on the other hand, the benefit of creating your own business is that once you hit that critical mass, there's no limit to what you can become. Do you pay the cost up front or at the end? If you want to do your own thing, you're going to pay that cost up front. And it could take you decades, it certainly did for me, to be able to get the profit. On the other hand, if you don't pay the cost up front, a lot of times you are susceptible to the company saying, when you're right at the peak of your power in terms of your ability to do your work, they can say, as we talked about with the horror story, they can say, hey, we don't need you anymore. You're too expensive. And I'm playing the game better than I've ever played it. And so the idea for me that I would retire doesn't even cross my mind, because this is who I am. So retire to what? It just doesn't exist.
Yeah, I was just with this group of people called the World Experience Organization. They are all people who do experience design. And the number of people in there who had left corporate jobs because it was not bringing the work to them that fulfilled them. And they set out on their own, and they are absolutely blazing their own paths. And it's got a lot of narrative tension because they're not sure where the next paycheck's coming from, but they are absolutely inventing their own future.
Yeah.
I'm always impressed, as somebody who did follow the other path, of people who are willing to go set out and live by their wits, absolute wits, and create their own thing. It's an impressive thing to do.
I was clueless for a long time, and because you have nothing to go on. You by very definition, you're creating your own path. And I just, especially in the world of story, the entertainment business at large, you're on your own. And so it is a very tough nut to crack. I always tell writers, your biggest challenge is psychological. Yeah, you got to learn the craft, but the toughest part about it is, can I hang in there long enough and deal with the defeat long enough, the pain and the poverty long enough? Because I have found that typically the people who are successful are the last people standing. It's a kind of a downer idea, but surprisingly true.
Thank you so much for coming on the show today. Where can people learn more about your work?
If they're interested in the book, just go to anatomyofgenres.com. That's one word, anatomyofgenres.com. If they're interested in courses or story software in terms of being a storyteller or writer and so on, just go to my main website, which is truby.com.
Which is Truby for anybody who is wondering. This was an absolute blast. Really enjoyed it.
Dart, I haven't had this much fun talking in a podcast for a long time. I love this subject. I love what you're doing, and I've loved our conversation. So thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.